I'm Joel Arnold with Foundation Baptist College. This is the class Elementary Greek, first semester. And this is now coming to chapter 7 in our textbook by Plummer and Merkel. And our study now is with contract verbs. Okay, now in order to get started with contract verbs, we really have to go back and do a quick review, just of how verbs in general work, some of the forms that we've learned so far. What we've studied are the present forms and the imperfects. And so under the present, our charts that you wanted to memorize were oase, amadeta usi, mai sai tai, methistha, and tai. And these are both the present active, middle passive indicatives, or these are both present indicatives in the active and the middle passive. And then what you learned was that you would combine these endings with the stem. The stem is derived, as you recall, by taking this luo form. So if this is my main form that I learn as my vocab, I take that luo form and I just check out the ending omega o. Cut that off. Okay, lu is now my stem. Luo, lues, lue, luamina, lueta, luusi. I give you these formula, which I think are really helpful to remember. So look through stem plus primary active endings. And over here, you're doing something similar, except stem plus connecting vowels plus primary middle passive endings. And the rule there was if it's a mu or a nu, it'll be followed by, or it'll use an omicron. So lu a mai, lu omitha. If it's any other letter, it'll be an epsilon in this connecting vowel spot. And so in this case, what that looks like here is lu estha. And so I put my forms together here, luamai, lue, luatai, luamatha, luestha, luantai. Okay, now what we can notice though is that I've got my stem in this case, fairly simple one. And so we're using lu as our stem plus, and I'm putting on endings. Everything works out well enough. I do a similar thing when I come over here to my imperfects. And in my imperfects, just to recall, we're just doing this as a review, nu, sigma, blank, mente, nu, are active endings. If I put that into augment plus stem plus connecting vowel plus ending, augment is the letter that goes on the front of it, an epsilon, plus stem, go augment, stem, connecting vowel ending. I'll end up with eluan, elus, elue, eluaman, elueta, eluan. And over in the middle passives, I'll have eluamain, eluu, elueta, eluamitha, eluestha, eluanta. Okay, now you'll notice again, I have this similar effect that's happening where I've got my stem right here, and then right after that, I'm tacking on a vowel and the rest of my ending. And that sets us up for what makes the contract verbs a little distinctive. Contract verbs are going to be those verbs that end, like in your vocabulary form, the form you learn in the book. They're going to end in some kind of vowel. Okay, so I'm going to read down the list. This is the list that Plummer gives on page 68. And so that's the vocabulary setting up for chapter 7, the contract verbs. And so these are all contract verbs that you're learning in this lesson. And those verbs are, just listen to the sound, something will stand out. Agapao, genao, aperotao, aiteo, akalutheo, zeteo, kaleo, laleo, martyreo, parakaleo, peripateo, poieo, phabeamai, pleirao. A huge number of those are actually, they're epsilon contract verbs, which is to say you're hearing aiteo, akalutheo, kaleo, etc. You're hearing that eh. But the thing that stands in common about all of these verbs in this lesson is that you'll have a vowel just before the ending. Okay, so I'll give you 3 example verbs that would be very much key representative verbs for the contract verb lesson or for learning how to handle contract verbs. And those are these 3. Poieo, so I've got an epsilon right here. Agapao, I've got an alpha right here. Pleirao, I've got an omicron right here. Okay, and these would be distinct from other verbs that would either end in, well, they might end like luo with an upsilon, or they might just end with a consonant. And so in those cases, I don't have any contract vowel that I have to combine. When we say contract vowels, these three vowels that I've circled, the poi e, the agapao, or the plerao, I've chosen these three vowels out on purpose because these each represent a class of contract verbs. And this is just how you would know or distinguish out a contract verb from another contract verb, that it's going to end in either an epsilon, so that's why I have here poieo. It'll end with an epsilon, an alpha, or an omicron, just before, of course, the omega. And that then would be my pattern that makes them a contract verb, poieo, agapao, plerao. Because what I'm going to have to do now when I work with these is I'm going to have to contract or combine in some ways this epsilon right here with whatever ending follows. Okay, just to illustrate what that looks like, let's try putting poieo out into my standard paradigm, like if I'm just going to use the present tense, the forms that we learned for there. And so if it's o, ace, a, omeneta, usi, you can see pretty quickly I'm going to have some kind of clash of vowels here when I'm doing, well, poieo for a starter, but let's do my next spot, ace. How's that ace? How's that going to work out? A. Even the other ones might not be as obviously a conflict, but amen, and down here I'll have two epsilons, won't I? Eta, and last usi. I just end up with a rather large cluster of vowels stuck here in the middle. That's the issue that we're trying to handle under contract verbs. Okay, let me pause for a second. I'll back up for a little bit. Sometimes students are wondering, are these, because they're contract verbs, is there some kind of exegetical thing that's going on? And the answer is no. These are, in terms of meaning or semantics or how they fit into a sentence or how you do your exegesis, these are just going to be normal verbs like any other verb. But there is enough of them, and they are going to combine in some kind of unexpected ways, enough that as you're reading along, you'll see some forms, and you'll just need to know what's going on. Like, what is this form? You're going to end up with some combinations inside that don't immediately register because the forms that you're looking at don't match anything that you've learned before. Let me show you a few examples of that. So here's a group of passages where you would actually find these verb forms, and they're not going to match what you've learned. This is the first person singular. Your vocabulary form was poieo, and yet when it's actually appearing in the real world, first person present active indicative, right? This would just be your top left form, your most basic form. What I'm actually getting instead of poieo is I'm getting poio. By what authority I do these things, poio. Right here, I've got a third person plural. This is a middle indicative. And so I'm expecting untie. And so according to the rules, I would expect poi, then connecting vowel, untie. So poi, untie. What I actually get is poi, untie. Similarly down here I'm looking at a present active indicative. It's a second person plural. My vocabulary form, agapao plus eta. I'm expecting agapaeta. What I'm getting is agapata. And we can go on, agapusen or agaposen. I've lost my alpha. Down here I'm expecting agapae. This is a third person singular. Present active indicative, third person singular, for he loves our nation. Instead of agapae, the epsilon has disappeared, the iota has become a circumflex underneath. Anyway, just weird things are happening, and this happens as well in the indicative. Down here I've got two examples of the indicative. Here we'll go with the imperfect. This is the imperfect active indicative third singular, so nu sigma blank, that spot. Okay, so I'm expecting something like augment, plerao, Okay, so far so good. And then when we saw it before, we had an epsilon there. What I've got here is oo. Okay, so what's happened? And that's essentially what we're working through in this lesson. What we're working through is just trying to understand the contract verb phenomenon, the morphology, what's happening to these verbs, so that when you hit something, you're not befuddled. Okay, now once you've actually deciphered and figured out, okay, this is a first person present active indicative, at that point, it's no different than any other first person present active indicatives. Okay, so there's no other exegetical significance to it once you've figured out what you're looking at. The figuring out what you're looking at, that's where all the action is. And I'll start out, because why not? I'll start out by scaring you with a big, scary, awful chart. This is the chart that you're going to work with for contract verbs. Okay, so the combination, or just how to read this chart, as you flow through it, you're taking, well, this would be like agapao type verb. So a verb that ends in a, agapao. And that form, as it combines across the agapao, if it's coming up against an epsilon iota, etc., that's what we're doing all the way across the top of the chart. Okay, and so that highlights some things. Like, let's just take this example, agapao. When it actually appears in the real world, those forms that we gave you at the end of chapter 6, those are just hypotheticals. In the real world, agapao is going to combine alpha and omega. And so it's just going to come out, and this is what you would see in the real world, agapo. Okay, the alpha has contracted into the omega. If you were going to your next spot on the chart, you remember that it's agapao or o, and next on the chart is ace. Okay, so I'm going to do agapa plus ace. And so what I'm going to end up in this spot is agapa, and there should be a iota subscript here, agapa with a iota subscript. The epsilon has contracted in and, just essentially mysteriously vanished. And I end up with this alpha plus iota subscript. And so on. As we work through the chart, each one of these combinations here, you're going to have some combination like that with the contract vowel, so here phileo or plerao, combining with the ending vowel. And so long as you work through and get the details of the chart, then this is the way they contract. These are the way the forms work. Okay, now I said it's maybe a debilitatingly intimidating chart, because as you look at it, you're tempted to say, how on earth am I going to memorize all of that information? It is a decent amount of information. How are you going to keep track of that? And I have some good news for you, at least some encouragement. The good news is, in New Testament Greek reading, or New Testament Greek study, we're not really concerned with language production. We don't need you to be able to create the words. We just need you to read the words. So really, as long as you can recognize a form when it comes at you, you'll be fine. And that means then, in a certain sense, I don't need you to know this chart on the level, for instance, that you would be able to entirely reproduce it. We just need you to know the chart, or know the forms, the conversions, well enough that when you meet something out there in the wild, you can recognize what happened. Your brain can more or less go down the process to be able to figure out what you're looking at. Okay, I have another bit of encouragement for you. And the encouragement with this goes that the only forms really where you get this kind of contraction would be in the present and the imperfect forms. Now, later on, we're going to learn some other forms. We're going to learn infinitives. And when you get into those, then yes, you would have some combinations. And far after that, we'll get into participles. There you do also have to have some combinations, though in that case, it's not that bad. There aren't really many vowels that you need to combine. So really, where you're having to use these forms, or where you're expecting the unusual transformations to happen, it's going to be in the present and the imperfect. Well, those are the tenses that you've learned so far. So it's really, again, I'm trying to encourage you, It's really not a massive phenomenon that you have to encounter all the time. You just need to know how to handle it in certain combinations. What does it do the rest of the time? Well, this is now where we're getting into some critical charts that you need to recognize and be able to handle. So here's something that you should memorize. While I would not say that you need to memorize that entire chart I showed you a moment ago, this you need to know. And what we're looking at here are the forms as a certain vowel lengthens. Omicron will lengthen across to omega. Lengthen, remember you learned short vowels, long vowels, okay? So the short vowel form turns into a long vowel form. We call that lengthening. That process is lengthening. Okay, the vowel lengthened, it turned into its long form. And so what we're saying here is that omicrons will convert, or they will lengthen to omegas. That's the connection between those verbs that you want to know. Alphas, the long form of an alpha is also an alpha, and epsilon will lengthen across to eta. Okay, you don't need to worry about this for now, but we will eventually start learning the future forms. And when we learn the future forms, one of the things we'll do is we'll have lu, the stem, plus sigma plus the ending. Okay, this sigma makes it a future. And why that's significant is if I put that into a future form with a contract verb. If I had a theoretical something like, I'm going to put plerao into the future, okay, plera plus the sigma, and then I put on my ending. Okay, with this chart right here, what we're saying to you is expect when the contract verb is trapped between two vowels, consonants, when there's not a vowel for it to contract with, like in all the other tenses that you're going to learn, the present, the aorist, and so forth, the future, the aorist, and so forth. When you learn those forms, you'll notice over here the omicron doesn't have another vowel to contract with, and so therefore what it will do in this case is that omicron will lengthen omicron to omega. And my form over here then is going to turn out to be not plerao, it's going to turn out to be pleroso. It's just following this pattern, omicrons lengthening to omegas. If I was looking at agapao, agapao would come out in the future form. Agapaso, the alpha would continue. And in the case of an epsilon verb, let's say phileo, the epsilon would lengthen to an eta, and so I end up with phileso. It's just the lengthening process. That's most of the verb forms that you encounter. Okay, so this chart right here, absolutely worth your time and trouble to memorize. That's a key chart. That one I want you to have. Another key chart I want you to have is here, what I'm just calling the vowel hierarchy. Okay, now this is, it's just a mnemonic way or kind of a way of organizing your understanding so that you can operate with the chart more quickly. But what I'm wanting to show you here is as the vowels combine, you'll expect that certain vowels are retained. Other vowels, you can almost imagine it like a little, they have their, they enter the boxing ring and one of those vowels is weaker. It falls to the other. Okay, so I'm giving you more or less kind of that hierarchy here. And again, just from mnemonic purposes, the yodas are almost always going to be retained. Yodas are almost always going to carry in, and they're going to carry in as yoda subscripts, with just a few exceptions. Most of the time, let's say I combine an omicron and an omicron yoda. What I'll end up with when this gets combined out, or actually let's do instead, we'll do the epsilon yoda. Epsilon yoda here, or I'm messing myself up. Let's do rather the eta yoda subscript here. Okay, I combine the alpha plus the eta yoda subscript. When I get into the other form, my result's going to be eta yoda subscript. Generally, that yoda wants to jump down beneath. And I will call then the yoda here a strong form. because it is going to be retained. You don't generally see those iotas vanishing off. Okay, that's going to be followed just under it by the omega. And the omega I'm going to call again a strong form because omegas are often the result that we get when we work the whole chart out. You'll notice over here, I have the omegas in this form over here, and I should have my iota, or excuse me, no, we're good. I have my forms combining across, alpha into an omega. Well, we just end up with omega. Epsilon into omega, end up with omega, and so forth. See, so an omega is a really strong form, if you want to refer to it that way or think of it that way. Okay, after that I have next in my hierarchy, I have an omicron. And my omicron is also a strong form, so let's jump across to over here. If I'm comparing up here, look across this bottom row, and I will just observe that the omicron combined across, I'm always ending up with a form that has an omicron in it, right? That omicron is very much getting retained as we work across. So that's why I've given it a next level in the hierarchy, followed by the alpha. If you notice the alphas here, look across this form, and I'll notice that the alphas are very much retained all the way across. The alpha is a strong form. The differences are the places where I have an alpha going up against an omicron. And there I end up with something like an omega. Because, remember, the omicron is a stronger form, it's higher in the hierarchy than the alpha is, and the omicron lengthens to an omega. Continuing down, I have the etas. Okay, let's look at the eta bar here. And you can notice that the alpha was stronger than the eta there. But here, the eta is stronger than the other forms. So we're getting into weaker letters that have fewer forms where it kind of overwhelms. And I get down my weakest forms, upsilon and epsilon. Epsilons are very often, if you want to call them, overwhelmed or overcome by the other vowels. So if I run across my epsilon row here, my epsilon row, I've lost to an eta. The omicron has been stronger. Okay. This is just a way, kind of a shorthand, of being able to quickly memorize and remember which form will win against another form. Okay, and the final thing I'll put in here is just a set of things to memorize. There are some key exceptions that are worth you remembering, and they are here. Epsilon plus epsilon or epsilon plus epsilon iota will give me epsilon iota. Omicron plus epsilon iota oi. Epsilon plus omicron, oo. If you'll work with those, like that set of information I've given you, these pieces, these 3 pieces to memorize, you very nearly know the chart. As I've said before, I don't think your first order benefit is going to come from memorizing the chart entirely. In fact, I would suggest memorizing the chart entirely. It could end up just becoming enough of a headache that you struggle with them a bit more. If you can get into your mind kind of a natural flow of what you're often seeing these letters do in the real world, then as you get out there and you start combining the forms, it becomes a little bit intuitive, kind of becomes natural, becomes mental habit. And for me, I think this way of setting it up actually helps me a little to keep track of the forms. Now, I'll go from there and say that Plummer gives a really helpful, or Plummer and Merkel give a really helpful chart to summarize or to compare these. This is found on page 73 and to page 74. And it's just a good place to spend maybe 10 minutes comparing the luo form versus what combines with poieo or agapao or pleireo. And I would go from there to say that if you can get to the point that you see an individual form and you have the ability to kind of process out, okay, I think what happened was, then you're okay. I'm entirely satisfied with that. Okay, so my biggest suggestion here is go to the parsing section that's the end of the lesson. It starts on page 75. Start practicing with some of those forms. Okay, and you can compare these to the key, where you're going to be able to see if you got it correct, or you could actually just plug some of these forms into an AI bot if you want, test yourself. Your goal really is just to have the ability to look at the form and not be thrown off by some of the unexpected vowel combinations that have happened. And if you can kind of see through the vowel combinations to be able to recognize your ending without it destroying the order of what's going on in that verb form, then you've basically mastered what you need to know with this section. Okay, the last thing that you need to have from this lesson, and this is something that is a basic core requirement for the lesson, this is a memory matter. You need to know the forms of ame. Now, we've already encountered some of the forms of ame. In the initial indicative, we learned here, in the present indicative, we learned here ame, a este, esmen, este, ac. Okay, so that's present indicative. We're going to learn now the imperfect indicative. And after this, we have one more, and that is the future indicative. And we'll pick up an infinitive and some participles. But for the indicatives, we just have 3. And the imperfect indicative forms that you'll need to know are as follows. So you need to know amen, ace, ain, amen, eta, and asan. Okay, now you can recognize that there are at least some similarities to things that you've already seen with your secondary active endings. So if you look nu, sigma, blank, men, ta, nu, you can recognize at least something here. This form right here, the sun, I recognize is going to be entirely unexpected. The reason that's happening, or what it's anticipating anyway, is something that we're going to learn in a future lesson with the aorist. The saw reminds you anyway of the aorist. And so languages, things wash between forms. This is not aorist, but that's a related form. Up here, this ending main, well, you can remember was not the secondary actives, it's the secondary middle passives. So main, sa, ta, methus, then ta. So that main sounds a little bit more like that. But actually, once you put those pieces together, I think you can recognize here that I've got at least enough similarity to endings that my root is this, if you want to call it a root, my root more or less is functionally this eta on the front, plus, roughly speaking, my secondary active endings, the endings I learned for the imperfect. And once I do that, I have the imperfect active indicative for ame. Reminder, ame is the verb for is. Present would be focused on time. With the ame verbs, we're not really working so much with aspect. We're really focused on just the time. And so if present is I am, you are, he is, down here with the imperfect active indicatives, then this is just going to be translated out as I was, you were, he was, we were, y'all were, and they were. And that's it. These are just the forms of is. And these are in the imperfect, which is to say past, for our purposes here now, past time. I do want to take a moment here, and let's look at a couple of examples where the contract verbs maybe make a bit of a difference in our interpretation out there. So this is running down forms mainly of poieo, but I think it points out some differences. If I'm looking here at this form, poi ace, if I didn't know how these contract verbs go, I would probably take this as a present active indicative, second person singular, and anyway, I might just be confused and not know. The fact that this vowel right here is lengthened, that it's an eta rather than an epsilon iota, that's telling me something else is going on here. And what's going on here is that this is actually a subjunctive. So therefore, whenever you should show mercy, it's translated in the ESV as give. Whenever you should give alms, basically. Well, this is a should. It's a subjunctive. It's a form we haven't learned yet. But the distinction here goes that you would have to know the contract verb rules to recognize that as a subjunctive. Whereas this over here, this is a regular indicative, poi e. The epsilon on the ending, or the stem, poi e, has combined with the usi. The epsilon is inside of here, it's folded in. And so I end up with poi usen, it's just a third person plural. Not a subjunctive, nothing particular going on. Got another example down here in Mark 11:28. Here, I'm looking at a second person present active indicative, poi e. The e plus the epsilon iota ending ace, e plus ace, well, it's just contracted in, and so I've ended up with poi ace. Whereas, right after it, I've got poi ace, eta iota subscript. And the only reason that can be happening is because I'm looking in that case at a present active subjunctive. And the meaning is going to be different. The subjunctive is a should idea. And so the reading of this goes, and they said to him, by what authority are you doing these things? Question mark. Remember this semicolon in our reading or our editions of Greek is a question mark. Or who gave to you this authority in order that you should do these things? It's a subjunctive. There are other ways that you could tell it's a subjunctive, but it sure helps to know your ending or your contract vowel rules to tell the difference. Down here, I've got something similar happening. So if this was an indicative, then I would be looking at poi usen. And that's because the epsilon would combine with the u, and I would just end up with u, poi usen. The fact that I have an omega here is telling me it's actually a subjunctive, whereas down here, I'm looking at an imperative. And the difference in knowing those, this could actually be also technically an indicative. The forms would be the same. It's writing, whether it's an indicative or subjunctive, on that contract vowel contraction and how those work out. Okay, my point in that is just to say that the rules do matter. Knowing your contract verb chart, or kind of knowing the contract verb dynamics and knowing what's happening in there will make a difference in your reading. And as I said earlier, my advice here is just get to the place where you've practiced enough with it or you've experienced enough how the verbs combine, how those vowels go together, so that when you encounter a form, you're not completely thrown off. You're roughly prepared to recognize what's happening. You will eventually build up kind of an intuitive awareness of how these work and be able to handle contract verbs without too much trouble. That's it for Chapter 7 on contract verbs, and we'll continue on from here, learning some other verb forms and how they morph as they are found in our Greek New Testaments.